Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're going to do a video like this. We did a video like this earlier in the week, last week or whatever, and it went pretty well. This is a little different, not the same type of video where we're reacting to my own videos, but I figured, we might as well get a little bit more into the community of Mythic Plus in general. So this got recommended to me by Sap Cutie, a friend of the channel. I actually got to meet him at BlizzCon, so that was awesome. Yeah, he's been around the Discord and everything, and he told me about this. So we're going to read this. All right, this is actually a really well done post, and I'm going to give my detailed thoughts. We're going to read every single word of it. It's quite long, okay? It can't possibly take as long as the previous video, I hope anyway. We'll find out, but regardless, we're going to read every single word. I'm going to give my opinions. The first time I've ever read this, but I think it's something that everybody should read, or everybody should be aware of more so. So kind of the main point of the video is to kind of spread awareness about it. I think I owe this to the Mythic Plus community. This is a person who I know to be very serious about Mythic Plus. Seems like they're even more serious this expansion than they were in Legion. I actually learned about them in Legion. I don't know if they would remember me, but I remember them. So anyway, let's check it out and, give my opinions, and we'll talk about what this person has to say about it. But I think this is going to be good. Stuff like this is really, I feel like this is really good for the community. So I'm happy to try to promote it. Okay. So Mythic Keystones Season 1 in review. All right, this is again from this person's opinion. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason. Let's see how this works first of all. Yeah, okay, good. I'm currently a 2400, forgive the stretch, whatever, brewmaster with experience in both Mythic Dungeon Invitationals, coming fourth in Americas in last tournament and top 8 world in the first. I have quite a few world first keys to my name and have been heavily involved in the community since 7.2.5 season. All this is to say, I am very passionate about Mythic Plus and have a great love for what the system is at its core. A scaling challenge where I can compete with the best in the world for the highest levels and fastest times. A dungeon, unlike a raid boss, is so long and has so many parts to it that there is almost never going to be a perfect solution for any dungeon, found for any dungeon. I'm really glad that that was prefaced. That's something that everybody should be aware of. If you're thinking about Mythic Plus and you've never really gotten into it, which I guess is not the case on this channel, people watching this, but regardless, if you've thought about progression rating and you've thought about like progression Mythic Plus keys, they're so vastly different you almost can't compare them, and this is why. Right, I've never really articulated this well, but this is absolutely why. It's so long and has so many, I would say, moving parts to it, especially with patrols, is that there's almost never going to be a perfect solution for any dungeon, and that's exactly the case. And this is kind of something that I like to embody when I pug. I like to try to find a perfect solution as adequately and like controllably as possible, but a lot of people don't want me to. So anyway, new and emerging strategies are always coming forward and pushing the boundaries of what was previously thought possible, which is always a fun challenge. And that's really, something that you're going to see in pretty much all speedrunning type communities. I watched a lot of Pokemon speedruns a long time ago, and, even now still, but there's always something different. This whole mentality that there's only one right way to do this, and if you don't do this the right way, the way I think is right, then you're not doing it right at all. And this, I'm really glad to see people who are serious about Mythic Plus, clearly serious about it, demonstratively serious about it. They understand that, and that, there's always new things, changes that can be made. And hopefully, that the people who are a little bit behind on those strategies, they don't feel like they need to constantly emulate. They don't need to constantly iterate upon their own runs if they're not at the edge of this progression. With that said, my desire for Mythic Plus to be all it could be is what brings me to write this post. I believe there's a lot that can be done to improve not just the rest of BFA, but the future of Mythic Plus. I'll start off by saying I'm going to do my best to not to make suggestions where possible. Historically speaking, suggestions don't usually get taken at face value and are usually taken as something to read through and see what the reason someone might be making a suggestion is. That's disappointing. I was definitely hoping to hear some suggestions. The best way to get our thoughts and feelings through to Blizzard is to get to the heart of the problem and explain it rather than have them try to infer what a problem is from a suggestion, as they might not come to the same conclusion as you. That's very true, though, at least. I'll break this post into several categories to keep my criticisms organized and easy to refer to. That's good to hear. Okay, so changes from Legion. This is a very hot topic, obviously, if you guys have been following the game. And I'm very interested in reading this part. You know what's sad, though? Man, this is sad. This has 38 replies, and probably a bunch of them are the same person. That is sad. That is really sad, man. The forums are weird. Anyway, changes from Legion. What better place to begin than the beginning? Several things were changed from Legion, with few being as impactful as the loss of gear swapping. Oh, that's good. That's a good point. I have mixed feelings about this change. I feel like it was definitely degenerate gameplay to have so many gear swaps in dungeons that you actually had to get another 10 from a weak aura. Yeah, that's exactly. I'm glad that that was let off as the main point. Personally, as a brewmaster towards the end of Legion, I had 16 gear sets that actually saw use in Mythic Plus, which is definitely ridiculous, and I don't miss that part of it at all. However, as we get to higher and higher keys, we begin to run into the same wall we had reached in Legion, where if you can't run tank trinkets, you have to bring classes with enough defensive to survive one-shot boss abilities. Similarly, if anyone without defensives is running tank trinkets to survive boss encounters, they're not going to be doing enough damage to beat cutting-edge keys. I think a lot of this comes down to boss design, so I won't go much further on there. On that here, other than to say that if we weren't presented with this problem, I would not have any doubt that no gear swaps is a good change. But that is absolutely what they want. Okay, so they do not want you to be like, they want you to be playing the game a certain way, and people don't like that, I understand, but they do not want you constantly switching gear every time a different challenge presents itself. They want the dungeon itself to be the challenge, and the smaller challenges that come through the dungeon to be something you're anticipating before you begin the key. So they're definitely right to say that you can't beat an entire timer wearing tank trinkets, and that it's also very dangerous to not have defensive focused trinkets or maybe even talents and other setups going into some of these 5. That's intentional. They want that challenge to be up and down for different reasons, So I understand. Trust me, I liked the gear swapping, but most of it was because of legendaries. There wouldn't really be a reason for me to be gear swapping nowadays. Anyway, another pretty significant change for more casual players is to move to having Fortified and Tyrannical at every level of Mythic Plus instead of at plus 10. I don't really have an opinion on the matter, as I don't typically run keys at levels where this would come into play. I'd be curious to hear what people who are running those keys feel about it. What people who are running those keys feel about it. Along with this change came a new affix at level 10, Infested. I have feelings on this, and I'll get to that in the dungeon affix setting. I mean, for me, I feel like this is there's nothing anybody should be talking about. If you're doing 2s and 3s, this is really the only time this matters, right? Like, the only time where you didn't have any affixes. The way it's changed is that, at least I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it's not just on top of what used to be there. I'm pretty sure weeks where it's not fortified, the trash is weaker than it was in Legion, right? There was this baseline scaling, and that's been brought back, and on top of that, and then integrated into that, they've added Tyrannical. So the scaling is higher on Tyrannical weeks, the scaling is higher on Fortified weeks, but it's not actually just objectively harder than it was in Legion. I'm not 100% sure of that. If I'm wrong, let me know, but I think that's the case. So the people saying this are, either way, it's really not something to be concerned with. The last thing to talk about here is mostly regarding class design and general CC/utility. While I have some more thoughts on this later, generally speaking, there has been a large loss of CC throughout the game. I agree that the emergent gameplay of pulling large, chain CCing, and destroying massive packs was not particularly challenging or engaging when running with the flavor of the month Blood Decay, since it's basically removed all difficulty of those otherwise very scary packs. I also know that the kind of gameplay we saw in the MDI and Nell Slayer, where the tank would pull absolutely massive packs together, put out some threat, and then kite until they die, was particularly stupid. I'm glad that they admit that. It wasn't fun to do as a tank, and there was a lot of pressure on getting everything grouped up and enough threat put out in the duration of a couple stuns to hold the pack for the rest of the pull, and then nothing else to do the rest of the fight except run away. I do think this problem was solved twice, however, with the changes to tank threat and having enemies cast on the closest target many of their abilities. It's kind of unfortunate a lot of the time being forced to stay in melee as a tank when I want to kite as part of my kit, since it means melee will die if they stay in themselves. It's the kind of choice that isn't fun for me, especially when combined with the fixes like Sanguine or Necrotic, or both, yikes, since it's either seriously limiting pull size in a way that doesn't feel good when I could do a pull when combined with some kiting, which should be a part of my toolkits. The threat change is already punishing enough for trying to kite extensively in a lot of cases. I feel like we're not far from going back to a triple range comp to get around the issue for some dungeons. Is that a bad thing? I don't look at that as a problem, honestly. And I feel like the whole kiting thing was never what they wanted. And you say you want it, it's fixed twice. And I understand that might seem like overkill, but to me, that's exactly how it should have been. It shouldn't even be possible to kite. The mob should just grip you back if you run too far away from them. It's one thing to like put a little distance between yourself, but the way people were doing it in Legion, it was absurd. You were fucking 100 yards away from these mobs. You know what I mean? That's not kiting, dude. That's not a dungeon. You know what I mean? That's just silliness. So I'm glad that that is not possible in Legion or in BFA. And, you know, even though some people do it a lot, like I think the way a monk should kite is by drop ring a piece and move away from the mobs. They shouldn't just be running backwards for a minute straight. You know what I mean? While all the mobs can't possibly do anything but get to them. And the reason the change that this person outlines, you know, I don't know where exactly, but where the top, yeah, here it is, the closest target many of the abilities. The reason this is done is because it was absurd how overpowered it was to not be in melee range as a tank in some dungeons in Legion. There was situations where you would kite mobs and they would be doing things, they would be trying to cast on their peers, right? Other mobs in the pack. And because they were not in range of the tank, they couldn't even do that. They couldn't heal each other. They couldn't do anything. They just ran. They did nothing. That's not a dungeon. You know what I mean? That should have never been allowed. And the fact that people were doing it so heavily is really, it had to be fixed. Had to be fixed. The removal of pylons is also some important utility in Legion that allowed for death skips by non-stealth classes that has led in part to the rogue meta of the first season. Fixed today, by the way. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I have more to talk about with regards to class balance, but I can't talk about pylons without talking about what the result has been. Shroud was in the game for a long time and was absolutely utilized in Legion Mythic Plus, but it didn't feel as required as it does now. There's a lot of very punishing trash where the reward doesn't match the difficulty/time it takes, and Shroud solves that problem like Pylon did in Legion. I don't want to say we need pylons back, but something that gives us the ability to dodge trash that we don't want to do, since a big part of the fun of Mythic Plus is coming up with new routes and strategies, which include skipping trash. Now, for me, I would rather skip no trash. I would rather the timer extended and you have to kill every single mob in the dungeon. That would be significantly more fun for me. I know that's not how everybody likes to play the game. But either way, in case you haven't seen it, I would definitely check it out on Wowhead. Apparently, people just discovered this. I don't know how the patch has been out for a month now, and people are just discovering this. But there's a new toy in the game that does allow you to basically do this. It's a 15-minute shadow meld, effectively. It works very different than shadow melds, and obviously it's a 15-minute CD. But regardless, it is, you know, arguably better, maybe slightly worse. It depends on the type of skip you're pulling off. But if you're trying to skip like a really, really large amount of trash, this is considerably better than Shroud. In the past, you would have seen dungeons completed with 2 Shrouds in Legion. People were doing that a lot in, I think it was the Cathedral dungeon, right? They were doing double Shroud because they wanted to skip the entire start of the dungeon. You could not have done that with without double Shroud. Now you can do it. You could have done it with Night Elves too, obviously. Now you can do it. So pretty much any of these Night Elf strats, you know, you're going to be able to replicate now as Horde too. So that's nice. But yeah, if you didn't know about that, I didn't know about it today, till today either. So. Boss design. A common complaint in Legion was the prevalence of bosses that could combo people down in extremely short spans and very likely counterplay with very little counterplay, except to run tank trinkets and get lucky. Bosses like Herja, Xavius, and Viceroy Nazar were brutal at the highest levels of play because of the rapid-fire abilities that could target the same person in quick succession and kill them at even moderate key levels. And I think, again, I don't think they intended that to be that way, okay? I think they just didn't make the dungeons with Mythic Plus in mind, and that's what happened. It led to people running immunity classes, tank trinkets, and praying to get through the bosses at the highest level. I'm happy to say these types of combos are much more rare in this expansion. Very rarely are there bosses with unavoidable damage that can combo up in a way that kills people without counterplay. One of the instances where this is the case, Overseer Korgus, who could stack 2 or even 3 of his stacks of the dot on people, which would almost definitely result in deaths, was changed this week to not be able to do that. That's great. This is absolutely positive. As a result of this week's changes, however, Lord Stormsong has the possibility of mind controlling someone, and then when they break the MC, they can get comboed down with Mind Rend without much of counterplay. The timing on breaking the MC is already really tight, and it's not usually viable to wait for the boss to cast Mind Rend to break it. This kind of change felt really regressive to me since I feel like it adds unavoidable deaths that are totally down to RNG. This mechanic makes no sense to me. I don't understand this boss. I don't understand it. Lord Stormsong, I did not know he even had this ability. He doesn't cast it. There's no timer for it from what I can tell. There's no indication it even happens other than you get hit by it. So I don't know how these guys even how do you even know it's happening? Is there some indicator, or is there some kind of weak aura maybe that they've made? And I understand why you think it's regressive, but I think this ability just shouldn't be in the game. It seems like a bug. It doesn't seem like it's supposed to be in the game. There's literally no indication that he even does it, to my knowledge at least. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know. But Yeah, I'm not really sure. I wouldn't look at these two things as the same. What are you talking about with Xavius and Herja? These mechanics just did way too much damage. It wasn't about counterplay. It was never about that. They just did way too much damage and happened way too frequently. They were the main part of the difficulty of the encounter, but they scaled up way too hard, especially compared to other dungeons and other bosses. So I would not look at this as the same problem. Again, I don't know anything about this mechanic, though. As I play a tank exclusively, I've never seen it, so I don't know. Anyway, I talked about not being able to change tank gear because a massive limiter to the keys will eventually be able to do it. Wait, what? I talked about not being able to change the tank gear being a massive limiter to the keys will eventually be able to do. I see. Even then, of course, there will still be an upper limit based on unavoidable damage we can take, but I personally don't enjoy this kind of limiter. The counterplay to these situations is to bring default tankier classes and gear more defensively, which is not going to play well with the time limits in dungeons and will still have an artificial limit. As much as I understand why scaling is what it is, and no matter what, you will always have some sort of upper limit, I feel like the timer is already such a strong limiter that there doesn't need to be what is, in my eyes, an artificial cap on what you can do from unavoidable one-shots by bosses. I think it's a really shallow point of view, and it's probably so shallow because of how specific this person is in their pursuits. But what you're talking about here is something that just can't be removed. You're either talking about removing mechanics like this, which I understand to be problematic, but again, I think it's comparing the Legion situation and the BFA one is really unfair. I would like to see more examples of bosses like this. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of many. But one thing that I do think is very important to understand here is the mechanics do more damage the higher you get on purpose. That's not a bug. You know what I mean? What is perhaps a bug is that you don't even know the mechanic is happening, like I said earlier. But the fact that you're going to die to damaging abilities in the dungeon that you're doing is not, that's intentional. Let's put it that way. And this upper limit has to be there. There's no way you can just kite your way through every dungeon. That's the thing I really dislike about the top groups. They don't even, the tank doesn't tank. You know, he just kites. And I don't feel like that's right. If anything, I'd say I wish the timer was more strict, because I would rather that, like, let the timer be the reason that they're not even able to get to that point. But right now, they're easily able to blow by these timers. I really don't think, I feel like if Blizzard saw these guys doing 22s, that they're probably not satisfied with that, right? And we're talking about 4 months into the expansion, people are doing 22s already. When the cap is 10, right? The gear cap is 10. That's 12 levels over the gear cap. That's already far, almost as aggressive, if not far more aggressive than anything we saw in Legion at this point. I don't think that's right. I think that's got to be adjusted. So I don't know. This is something that I feel like it reminds me of, like, you know, it's like an embarrassment of riches. It's like, look how good we are. We can be so good that we just can't play the game anymore. You know what I mean? It's like, I feel like this is working as intended. A couple of quick examples of problem bosses that don't really fit the two previous categories before I move on. All right, this is good. The captain's boss when Eudora and Raoul are together is vastly more punishing than other combinations. Yeah, Eudora's a bitch, man. The blackout barrel has to be cheesed with a rogue and other immunities to have much of a chance at surviving it if Eudora does her grape shot at the same time. That's true. So that's probably, yeah, I don't know if they would want them to interact that way. The trio boss in King's Rest has its moments of being pretty hard without ability overlaps from the other bosses you've already killed, but getting Zanzel's Call of the Elements cast while fighting another boss is almost an impossible task. I wish they would just remove that part of the boss, honestly. I don't feel like these bosses need to echo each other. That boss is already complicated enough. Just make it 3 bosses. There's no need to interact. I wish that was removed. I don't like that boss. Between the boss getting shielded and having to kill 4 totems worth of health, it extends fights that don't feel balanced around having that mechanic to the point of absurdity, especially since it's random. Especially since sometimes that mechanic doesn't even get echoed, you know? Beyond that, it's totally random if you get it or you don't. Good. I'm glad we agree there. And with the time it takes to deal with the first totem, you can pretty easily get a second set as well. Akali's barrel through in other phases as well can be pretty rough since it's not always clear where she is until she's about to charge. Yeah, I wish they would just remove that. This is where I would have mentioned Elderly Exa being completely unfair and unfun, as at high keys enough. Yeah, we know all about that one. I'm glad that they fixed that as well. So anyway, moving on, it seems. Trash design. I mentioned earlier that a lot of CC was stripped away from classes. So I think what they're talking about here is by CC, they mean AoE stuns, right? They've definitely not. Like, I guess there's been some hard CC removed, like Shamans, Bind Elemental and stuff, but I don't think anybody's really doing that. Maybe they are, but regardless, which crushed the usual strategy of pull big, chain CC, blow LCDs. It's hard that, you know, it's hard to talk about CC for me because I feel like that's not CC, but whatever. Talking about AoE stuns. Blow all CDs, pull small until next time that's possible. That was paired with trash in every dungeon, becoming much more complex than it was in Legion, to the point where that strategy wouldn't even be doable at the same level it was without losing all the CC. That said, I think in general it's a healthy change to put more emphasis on trash being the pressure points of dungeons and where the most challenge is. That is simply because this is where the most counterplay can take place and where strategies have the most room to grow and evolve. Having dangerous trash doesn't completely limit your strategies to pull one thing at a time. Instead, it makes you consider a more staggered CC order and to interrupt important abilities, as well as makes interrupting much more important than in Legion. Though this is also majorly due to arcane torrents removal. Yes, it also makes you consider what you're pulling together. Instead of our cooldowns are up, let's pull 2 to 3 closest packs together and blow them up. And often becomes our cooldowns are up. This very hard pack is in the way of a large pull we could do, so we can do it now and save CDs, or we can try to combine this with a very low danger trash, or we could skip it with Shroud and do the big pull right away, etc. Not to say this didn't happen in Legion, but it's much more common now. I like this kind of challenge and the strategy it helps to create. So basically they're saying that trash is harder. And again, I think that's absolutely what Blizzard intended. I don't think they would have ever wanted these Mythic Plus dungeon, you know, max keystone pushing groups to be pulling like 10 mobs together and kiting them around in circles. It's just not it's not a dungeon at that point, you know what I mean? And I know it's possible and fully supported gameplay, but if your tank doesn't get hit, then what is he there for? You know what I mean? I don't know. I never liked this. I never liked that in Legion, and I certainly like that it's gone in BFA. So this whole pull many mobs together and struggle because you pulled too many mobs. Yeah, I don't know. You know, you're talking about content that you're not supposed to really be in. Really talking about anything above a 20, you're probably, you know, I don't think Blizzard would have expected anybody to be at this level at this point in the expansion. So you're going to have to fiddle with it, you know. I think that's the way of it. That said, I do feel like I am unable to make these kinds of decisions at all with some infested patterns, but that is for another section, and infested's gone in a couple days, so who cares. I'll also say there's some trash that feels really unfair and unfun. The recent hot fixes have addressed a lot of my issues, and I don't want to spend too much time detailing every single enemy I have issues with, so I'll just go over some highlights. I'll also say there's some trash that feels really unfair and unfun. Spectral Berserkers and King's Rest are insanely punishing. The change to make them CCable again didn't do anything because before the 8.1 patch they were already CCable. Their bleed effect hits very hard baseline, let alone when you pull 2 of them, and it's an extremely punishing dot. If they're able to stack another on you, it's a really low survival rate. This is another mob that you can't kite effectively either, since it will target someone else if you aren't in range, often sacrificing that person in the process. If you have a pet class in your group, you can bait the bleeds onto it, but it feels in general too punishing. So I understand why they would say this, right? The Spectral Berserkers are extremely difficult mob types. And, you know, even on the lower, you know, the keys that I do, they kill me all the time. But again, that's what they want. You know, they want these mobs to be dangerous. The problem is, compared to every other mob in the video game, this one might be one of the hardest. And that's not necessarily a problem. It's just this dungeon seems to have a lot of really hard trash. You know what I mean? This dungeon's trash is arguably considerably harder than any other dungeon's trash. And that might be the problem. It's not that this Spectral Berserker can't be kited. It's just that it's really out of place how much damage it does compared to other mobs that you've expected to fight. If every pack had mobs like this, I think the game would be more fun. If there was a way to, you know, make your pulls, you have to be like actually aware of what you're pulling at all times, not just, all right, pull it all, interrupt, we're good, run. You know what I mean? That sucks. And I think that's the worst part about Mythic Plus is that people, if they don't get like crushed by these mobs, they don't even know they exist. The fact that we're talking about a single mob type by name in a dungeon by name, talking about being insanely punishing, means the mob is dangerous. Mobs are supposed to be dangerous. It's just the difference in the danger is a bit absurd, and I don't know if they can fix that. So anyway, staying with King's Rest for a second, Shadow of Zul is not a fun encounter. He does incessant and extreme damage for a prolonged amount of time where, funny enough, the counterplay is to run as far away as possible after your CDs are over. I don't have the tools to deal with that enemy after I blow through my CDs, and he comes right before a very hard-hitting boss. It's a frustrating rock and a hard place situation. There's some other trash monsters that I have issues with, but generally speaking, it's safe to say my problems come from enemies that have no-win situations like the ones listed here. And that's a great example. Shadow of Zul obviously is incredibly difficult. Again, another thing in that dungeon that's just way out of place compared to other things. First of all, how many mini-bosses are there? And by mini-bosses, I mean trash that is affected by fortified that is very long, very dangerous, a single piece. The one I think of is the turtle in Freehold, but that's nowhere near as dangerous as the Shadow of Zul. I think Shadow of Zul is definitely the hardest mini-boss, and I'm not really sure of many other ones. I guess some of the ones in Shrine you could consider mini-bosses. But yeah, they're really out of place, Shadow of Zul and the Spectral Berserker, right? So, I don't know. I think, you know, they could be nerfed, but they're still going to be harder than everything else, and that's the design of the mechanic. That is the design of the part of the dungeon that you're in. But yeah, I do understand why people would say that. Okay, dungeon design. Let's take a look. I want to talk about dungeons in the context of being vehicles for an interesting Mythic Plus challenge rather than for storytelling, as that is not something I can comment on since I don't play the game for the story, which is a shame because they should be both, right? And not just story. I mean, that's really a silly thing to even say. Dungeons are not just about challenging Mythic Plus content, and you know, I would probably say a similar, like I would say almost the same thing if you're to ask me this, but it's like there's so much more to it than that. And the reason that whatever you're about to say might be being said is because you don't realize that they have to do both. You know what I mean? They have to do it for also storytelling and theme. And if they were able to make dungeons completely devoid of story, they would be far more competitive, far more challenging. They'd be able to do things way greater. You know what I mean? And that's why I like Motherlode so much, because it feels like it's not even related to the current story, but they're able to intermingle very unique trash and very unique bosses, very interesting situations in a dungeon like that. They didn't have to worry about story in there because it basically doesn't have anything to do with the expansion. So I like stuff like that. Anyway, on the whole, I feel like dungeon design has not evolved from Legion in a lot of areas. I don't have a problem with the dungeons being or feeling linear as at its root. Several dungeons are very linear that I feel are very well designed, like Shrine of the Storm or the Motherlode, all caps. What those dungeons do very well is they give you a lot of choice in what you pull and when. Several dungeons... Wait, I thought you said they were linear. I'm confused. Anyway, Motherlode in particular, along with Freehold, have excessive amounts of trash that really make it feel like you can do anything you can imagine in those places, and it's not wrong. It gives a lot of creative freedom when we're developing strategies and makes for a dynamic and interesting experience. As I have said before and will always say, the trash for me is where the focus of Mythic Plus should be, as it allows you to play around it and make strategic decisions more than just the execution part. I'm glad to hear that. That is my thoughts 100%. I think trash should always be the focus of the 5-man, and I'm glad that the bosses are no longer these impenetrable walls. And I think I'm glad to hear the Motherlode brought up multiple times there, because this is the dungeon that I think is the best in BFA. I think Motherlode and, you know, to some degree Freehold, and really, you know, those might be considered one of the easier sets of dungeons, and that's because you have this excessive amount of trash with a lot of creative freedom. You know what I mean? I feel like that is the reason, and also because the bosses aren't crazy. But I think that's great. I think that's a really good point, and I'm glad that was brought up. Where I think the mark was missed is in Temple of Sethraliss, but especially in King's Rest. Temple still has some choices you make early on, but exactly 52.73% of the trash is required to spawn the last 3 bosses. That's interesting. This, along with some trash you can't reasonably skip, and most of the decisions are made for you. However, the by far biggest offenders, King's Rest, where 64.29% of the trash is required just to spawn the bosses, advance through the ocean, and not get destroyed by Mchimba. Now, it's interesting that this gets brought up because King's Rest is a very unique dungeon. It's got very little trash. So I kind of wish, on top of the percentages, which are, you know, very accurate, I'm sure, they also included how many pulls that was, how many different pulls of mobs that was, and how many mobs specifically as well, how much health was required in that 64%. Because I think the thing is, that 64% is actually very few pulls. It's very little trash compared to Temple of Sethraliss or Freehold. You know what I mean? You have to pull way more mobs in Freehold to get 100%. King's Rest, very little trash in that dungeon. So I understand why people are really focused on the trash in this dungeon, because every mob is basically a mini-boss. Every mob counts for far more, has way more mechanics. They have to jam way more into this small amount of trash just to make this dungeon feel like it's got a lot of trash, a lot of trash value to it, you know? Anyway, there's no real choice here, and it makes the dungeon feel bad from a strategic point of view. So much of the fun is developing interesting new strategies, but King's Rest is basically a numbers and execution state. Yeah, that's true. Like the patchwork of dungeons. That's a good point. I understand that point entirely. I think, again, I think you're just dealing with inexperience. Like, they're just not well-created dungeons. You know, they're not going to make 10 great dungeons. They don't really know everything. Like, they couldn't have predicted how every single one of these is going to play out. And people are like, oh, that's what the beta's for. Unfortunately, it's too late. They're not going to redesign dungeons after the beta's been done. You know what I mean? Even though we might think that's what the beta's for, it's really not what the beta's for. So anyway, I understand that point, and I sympathize for sure. Another sticky point for me is Waycrest Manor's extreme randomness in determining your route. Now, that's probably the best example of problems here. 3 possible routes with rotating witch spawns and infested makes this place a nightmare to strategize around. A big problem with this too is that you're forced down a much less efficient route when you get either of the right side openings, but especially the top right where you have to go through the least efficient trash in the dungeon. Rawl's hallway filled with maggots worth only 1 count each, but very deadly in large numbers. This is also the problem of enemies directly in your path not being worth count towards enemy forces, such as gore-stained piglets, or even enemies a little outside the path, but still a potential option were they worth anything like the Faceless Maidens next to the top right path. This is a great, I'm glad that they're putting this down here on paper. My personal belief is that anything you can or should reasonably be able to pull there that aren't just absurd amounts of like the rowdy revelers or foot bomb hooligans and motherload should be worth something to pull. But anything that is 100% in the path should be worth something and accounted for in the enemy forces. I know I wasn't going to make suggestions, probably just this one. Yeah, that's actually a great point. If you have to kill it, it should count. It should count for something, right? So this is great. Waycrest Manor, I think, is probably the worst Mythic Plus design ever. I like the dungeon. I like the idea of the dungeon. It's a great dungeon. Some of the bosses are interesting. You know, 2 or 3 of them are really fun, actually, for me as a tank. But in terms of a timed run, it just makes no sense. It is so much, at least in my opinion, it's so much easier if you get a certain route and you don't have like infested problems on that side. I really dislike doing this dungeon week to week, but for the way I do it, it's actually pretty easy, so I don't mind it. But it's just not a great Mythic Plus dungeon. I feel like they really they messed up making all those different routes. And again, you don't know what the route is going to be until you start the dungeon, right? That's not good. That is not a good idea. Anyway, on a final note here, I have only done the Horde version of Siege of Bralis, but I'm told that the Alliance version is much more difficult. Much more difficult, actually. I don't have anything to say on the matter, but I'm curious about what other feel on that version of Siege of Bralis and if it's something that bothers them. I would like to hear your thoughts on this too. If you guys are reading this or listening to this and you're Alliance players, please explain to me what the difference is. I have no idea what the difference is. I can't understand how it could be that much different. What, do the bosses have different mechanics? I know one's like an ogre and one's a human, but do they do something different? Or are they the same? What's different about the dungeon? I know you start in a different place, but the beginning of the dungeon is just all this fodder. Like, it's almost like it shouldn't even be there. I don't know. I don't know anything about that. But Siege of Bralis is another one. I think it's just, you know, and okay, we have to go back to this. We have to go back to this. I don't play the game for the story. Unfortunately, there's no option. You know what I mean? That has to be there. Siege of Bralis is that way for that reason. It's part of the story. That's why they did it. So it's like the two are at odds. We have to talk about this more because I don't know what the answer is. Do you just make separate dungeons that aren't even like for Mythic 0 and for Heroic and all that? That are just for Mythic Plus? I don't think you can do that. I don't know, man. It's kind of sad. It's kind of sad to think about. Affix design. This section is hard to talk about without getting into the reward structure, since one of the only reasons for people to push very high keys is to be ranked on a third-party website against each other, sadly. This makes it hard to find reasons to even do Mythic Plus on weeks with prohibitively hard or time-consuming affix weeks. That's really sad to hear from somebody who's apparently serious about this. So for this section, I'm simply going to be talking about the enjoyment level of different affixes and how they feel together without considering how worthwhile they are to do. Let me put it this way. I'm going to say this right now. If you feel this way, if you feel like there's no reason to do Mythic Plus when the dungeon is hard compared to when the dungeon is easy, I'm not sure you like the system, man. We're just talking about that on stream. It's like people are like, oh my God, Mythic Plus is so much more fun this week because it's the current week, if you're watching this, is really easy. It's volcanic and teeming on a tyrannical week, right? One of the easiest weeks. People are like, oh, there's so much fun this week. It's like, man, it's sad. It's sad that we're talking about the game being more fun when it's easier. Like, I don't know what that says, man. I don't know what to do. How do you do that? How do you deal with that as a Blizzard developer? How do you deal with that? Like, these guys, they have more fun when things are easier. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I don't know. I don't know how to deal with that. But I have to, you know, it's sad to hear it from even the highest end. People who are doing this for many, 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 many hours a week at the highest level. Even they're saying this. They feel like it's not, that it's hard to find reasons to even do Mythic Plus with prohibitively hard or time-consuming affix weeks. That's sad, man. That is sad to hear that. The big one to talk about is obviously Infested. Being an affix that is omnipresent but has a 3-week rotation about it was an interesting idea, but the execution feels bad in a lot of cases. The biggest problems with Infested were how it would sometimes artificially limit what you could pull by making a non-CCable mob infested. Yeah, I think that's right, which meant that you were basically forced to kill it before you could move on or skip it. That's the problem, right? Not every mob could be slowed. Not every mob could be CC'd. Not every mob could be stunned. So I think no matter what changes, you know, whatever the new affixes are, Infested's biggest mistake was that it made non-CCable mobs infested. I love the idea of Infested. Absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. But the fact that you cannot CC every infested mob, I don't like at all. And I don't really even CC infested mobs anymore, sadly. The times where Infested felt cool was when you were able to CC a mob in 2 or 3 or 4 different packs at the same time. After you kill all the non-infested enemies, fight them all together. Yeah, very high skill point there. That was a cool and interesting challenge for me, since it once again served as a solvable problem with clever play and strategy, rather than a fixed point wall like a mini-boss. Yeah, I would say that too. The other big problem I have with Infested is how it combines with other fixes to be a lot less fair of a fair challenge and more like the game is cheating you. Sanguine, for instance, can be really silly combination with Infested, as they can and will run through or even spawn in Sanguine pools that could be very large. Yeah, we talked about this a couple times throughout the channel's coverage of Mythic Plus. Sanguine is like one of the hardest affixes in the game right now, and it's because of Infested, honestly. The biggest problem, though, is its interaction with Fortified. The fact that the spawns of Gahun have 20% more HP on Fortified weeks is really silly to me. It's an affix. It as an affix is already challenging enough. Why does it need to be further compounded on by Fortified? I totally agree. The fact that Infest has no impact on bosses whatsoever makes me really curious why they made Fortified a part of it. Like, so you're just making trash like twice as hard now with both of these affixes. I don't understand why they did that. And they probably don't understand why they did that, knowing Blizzard. Speaking of Fortified, it's clear that there's much greater parity at this point in the game between Fortified and Tyrannical, with Tyrannical actually being the preference so far. This should change after we reach high enough key levels where boss health and unavoidable damage scaling faster than the trash health. Fortified being harder isn't a bad thing in my eyes, as it means the trash is hard enough and interesting enough to merit that fact. I totally agree. However, some of the interactions with Fortified have unjustly increased the difficulty in my eyes, despite the affix alone being totally competent without being buffed further. I mentioned the Infested interaction already, but it has the same interaction with teaming and explosive of all things. So does it really? Wait, the explosive orbs are stronger in Fortified? I did not know that. If that's the case, then again, I agree that it shouldn't. Well, it's a little different, though. Because explosive does have an interaction with the boss, right? The boss is going to spawn explosives. So I don't know how I feel about that. I didn't know that this was the case, so let's not comment. I feel like it shouldn't be too difficult to make explosives not interact with Fortified, as it's already a hard affix on its own. It doesn't need 20% more HP on top of scaling with key level. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. Let's move on. Sanguine is no longer an affix with how tight a lot of the corridors are. Is no longer a non-affix, of course. And that's a change for the best. I'm glad that they're saying that because, you know, it was absolutely ridiculous how easy Sanguine was last expansion. That said, the fleeing mobs feel like a slap in the face in Tol'dagor, since the counterplay to enemies running is to just keep pulling packs backwards. Also, since there are many more casting enemies, you can find yourself stuck on a mob that just won't move and can't be moved by anything since they're already doing their casts. It's not a good feeling, but there is counterplay to it, so I don't feel like I have no options on enemies like that. Obviously, there's a lot of counterplay. Not all tanks have as much as others. Obviously, Brewmaster and Blood DK have the most, but I don't really know. Sanguine just sucks now, man. It's crazy. It's like the hardest affix, if you ask me. It's one of the hardest affix to tank on because, especially with Infested, it's just so punishing. But, you know, that's what happens when you just abuse Sanguine. Sanguine Week's just abused over and over and over and over again for a year, 2 years straight in Legion. Necrotic is a really frustrating one this expansion, especially when combined with something like Sanguine, where you need to control the placement of enemies. As previously mentioned, there are many mobs that will cast on the closest target if the tank isn't enraged, and Necrotic completely and totally necessitates kiting. I don't think it does. This doesn't feel like a fair interaction, especially on a Brewmaster where I have to kite long before I'm close to death, or I will die to stagger and the necrotic dot in combination. It's because you're choosing to play a Brewmaster. As an Affix, I think this creates a lot of interesting challenge, but it's simply not fair at all on some packs if you want to bring melee to anything. Let's talk about this a little bit more securely. Necrotic was changed to being a physical debuff. I think that is a nerf to the mechanic. I think it makes it easier to deal with, a little harder for blood decay, but in general for most tanks it's going to make it slightly easier to deal with, okay? But the problem here is that you can't kite when you want to kite. And this is talking about the previous form of kiting too. That is just literally pulling all the mobs and never getting meleeed by them. That's not what Necrotic's point is. It's never meant to be that point. So when they're talking about getting hit by things like these mobs doing things if a tank isn't in rage, it's like you put yourself in this position. You know what I mean? Like, this is what happened in Legion. They had to do this. It's not an option. They can't just make these casters not do anything. They can't. The casters just can't be like, wait, where are you going? I'm trying to cast. You know what I mean? Like, it's not fair. It's not how the dungeon's meant to be done. And I understand why it seems weird, but it's like, if you're not a tank and you're tanking the mob, which is effectively what's happening here, you're gonna die. There needs to be a tank to get hit by these things. So whether or not you're doing it because you're kiting or whatever else is happening, this is the way it's got to be. You know what I mean? If the mobs just don't do anything because their target isn't in range, they're not mobs. They're just random. You know, it's just a roll of the dice. Pull them, roll away from them, never deal with any of the mechanics. That's not how it's supposed to be. But for Necrotic, I totally sympathize. Again, this is a problem with something else, which I don't think is related to Necrotic in any way. It's a problem that the community put Blizzard in, and Blizzard had to respond to it. But for Necrotic, I hate Necrotic for one reason. It's because not every mob can be slowed. There's no reason for this in a dungeon. If it's not a boss, it should be slowable. It should be stunnable, maybe. It should be CCable. That's my opinion, okay? I think every single bunch of trash should be able to be manipulated in every way. And that's why I've always loved 5-mans, because grips, knockbacks, stuns, interrupts, AoE silences, things like this have almost no place in raids. Almost no place. And the tanks are the ones that do them. That's why I love tanking. So much control over the pack. So many ways to integrate yourself into the dungeon's challenge. Outplay the dungeon's challenge. You cannot do that with Necrotic on many different types of mobs. And that is really, really frustrating. Absolutely hate Necrotic for that reason. It is certainly not because I just want to run away from every mob in the game, and I get frustrated when that mob then decides it doesn't want to run away. It doesn't want to chase me for a half hour. It wants to kill somebody else that's in range of it. You know what I mean? Anyway, I mentioned explosives interactions with Fortified being at issue, but I should say that as its own Affix, it still feels really bad when only a couple of my abilities even hit it and not my strongest ones. Yeah, that's an interesting problem for Brewmaster. I don't know. Let's see what they say. I saw in the patch notes that target abilities will now hit it, but I don't know if that means things like Keg Smash, since while it's targeted, it differs from the abilities given as example, since it isn't a chain but a pure AoE. From what I could tell, Keg Smash should now hit it. Breath of Fire will not. Even though it's a targeted ability, it will hit anything in front of you and not just a target. You have to have a target, and then as long as you target that explosive, it will hit it. This was not happening in the past, and I do hope that is the change, because if it is, that fixes it all, in my opinion. But Blood Boil is not going to hit it. It doesn't need to be targeted on a mob, you understand? Heart Strike, it cleaves off the target. It's gonna work. Blood Boil does not work that way. I seriously hope it does, and look forward to testing it out, since many classes, myself included, rely on what are technically AoE abilities to do single target damage. Perfectly understandable. I understand completely not being able to AoE explosives, but as long as you cannot hit them with core abilities, I will never think this is a good, fun, or fair fix. Yep, I understand the point, but you know, you're not going to be able to change that on like something like Breath of Fire. It would be way too easy to use. You can't guarantee that there's no way for Blizzard to know that you're using it to kill the explosive, you know? So either make Breath of Fire a targeted AoE ability, or it's not going to work. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure Keg Smash is going to work. I think that was probably not intended, honestly, that abilities like Avenging Shield and Avenger's Shield and, you know, whatever else Paladins have that weren't hitting it. All right, Bolstering and Explosive both slow down a dungeon pretty immensely, but Bolstering in particular can force you into a comp that feeds damage into a Subtlety Rogue, so you can kill non-CCable enemies that are only pulled with smaller, easier to kill enemies. It's not in the game anymore, right? I don't think it is. There are a lot of instances of this, and it often requires DPS to not press buttons in their core rotation when fighting a pack so they don't passively cleave down low HP enemies. isn't fun to have to not press your buttons so consistently throughout a dungeon. Well, then you're not going to like Classic. I hate to tell you that. You know, that's the thing that really sucks about what the game has become now. It's like there's no reason to ever not fight everything. So to complain about not being able to AoE everything just seems really like, I don't want to say entitled, but it seems really odd to me. It's like, and that's the point of the Affix, right? Bolstering is there to make the trash more difficult to deal with. But bolstering really does slow down the dungeon far too much. And there's ways to deal with it properly, but yeah, I mean, that's the point. You're not supposed to just AoE it all down. That's the point of the Affix. But I do wish that it didn't slow the dungeon down as much as it did, although I do kind of like it. Once again, the relative difficulty and time increases of some Affix is vastly disproportionate to others, and it leads to a situation of not wanting to even bother with them. That is really sad that you're admitting that. That's really sad. Obviously, they're right. Vastly disproportionate is a very kind way of saying it. Some Affixes are considerably easier. Some Affixes are considerably harder. It's just how it is. Kind of that way in Legion 2, to be fair. A little bit worse in BFA because a lot of the Affixes deal with trash, and trash is now considerably harder than it was in Legion. But to say that you don't even want to do dungeons, that, you know, I don't. Anyway, I'll talk more about this later. Sounds good. How much time we got? How much more we got here? Oh, we got a lot left. All right, so let's keep moving. Class balance is next. Let's take a look. I don't want to talk about this too much, but apparently I will anyway, XD. It was clear towards the middle and the end of Legion there was one top-tier tank and two top-tier healers, and that wasn't a problem of community perception, but too much utility being given to those specs. Okay, let's see what they have to say about this. Generally, I feel like class balance is in a better state than the last half of Legion, but still room to grow. I agree. A lot of the problems are community perception, and those will change. Wow, that's really good to hear that from somebody else. Especially when the MDI comes and people have an opportunity to try new combinations and find some new powerful combinations. That said, there have been some clear outliers this season as too strong or required in the DPS category, those being rogues in general. Yeah, a big part of it is Shroud, right? So the Shroud utility along with Sap to skip enemies is incredibly potent in Mythic dungeons. I've already gone over part of why I think that is, and I don't think that just making Shroud terrible is the best option. Skipping enemies is, as I've said, a key part to what makes Mythic Plus so interesting. Having Shroud or Resto Druid Stealth be the only option, however, isn't healthy, and pigeonholes groups into comp they might not run if given other options. It also causes a really large disconnect between what the top groups that are everyone watches can do and what groups doing less competitive keys can reasonably do, even if they wanted to do similar stuff. Rogue is also a very tanky DPS in general with strong defensive cooldowns and a cheat death. Subtlety was nerfed this patch for good reason, and their focused single target damage with cannon fodder has been huge for a long time, and it was just as strong before the patch. That said, every rogue spec performs quite well in Mythic Plus even now. There's just no reason not to bring one, and lots of reasons you need one. Yeah, I mean, it's true, but again, a lot of it is Shroud. I think this is really short-sighted, again, to be saying this, what they're saying about classes. I guess they're not going to talk about Legion, which is sad, because in my opinion, it was far worse than Legion. Anyway, let's keep going. Demon Hunters have been highly sought after DPS's expansion, once again being extremely tanky and bringing in Prison, which lets you skip a lot of enemies, especially when combined with Sap from a rogue. To add it, they have a group CD in Darkness, which is very potent in some circumstances, but is essentially always free damage reduction on demand for the group or the tank. Something of a sore spot is them being the only thing to bring 5% magic damage reduction. That's the problem. Chaos Brand. 3 of 5 buffs can be brought at 70% power with consumables, so it's a little obnoxious that the Monk and Demon Hunter are the only ones to bring those buffs at all. That said, Demon Hunter is not nearly as required as Rogue in the current meta and serves mostly as a very powerful pick in near every situation without much downside. The thing for Demon Hunter for me, very big access, very easy access to high DPS, and they have a very balanced utility kit and very good bulk. So yeah, really the trifecta there. Kind of like Bombkin last expansion. Kind of like Warlock last expansion. You know what I mean? This is always the case. Kind of like Ellie Shaman in Mop CMs. Kind of like Enhancement Shaman in WAD CMs. There's always going to be classes that just have a better kit for 5-mans. Mage and Bombkin I'll talk very briefly about, as a lot of what I said about Demon Hunter can be said about both of these. Bombkin having extremely high armor to mitigate physical damage, a short defensive CD and Barkskin while being able to effectively off-heal in a pinch, along with very potent burst damage when using Lively Spirit, along with other utility spells, has put them as a clear and safe choice for a ranged spec when building a group. Mage has brought unmatched slows as Frost and extremely high AoE burst as Fire, while having an immunity, or 2 with Frost, and a cheat death as Fire. Their on-demand barrier spell can also act as a quick max HP increase for incoming bursts. I expect to see more ranged classes to see playtime with recent adjustments to these specs, though I don't see either of these losing their spot as a top range spec. Okay. I agree. Bombkin and Mage are very good picks. Bombkin especially. I picked Bombkin in every dungeon I could, especially because it has battle res and a lot of very strong utility overall. Very good bulk as well. Both of those are probably the bulkiest range right now for sure. Briefly touching on the tanking situation, it's obviously been that the DK show once again. It's a DK show once again, with monks making appearances in very high keys. I think a lot of this is community perception. Very glad to hear that. But Demon Hunter is the only tank in the game that brings anything like DK utility without the survivability. Yeah, it's funny, right? Demon Hunter, I feel like it's so good. Anyway, Monk brings unmatched survivability with limited utility like Ring of Peace, off heals, and the best kiting toolkit in the game for when that's possible. Did they really just say limited utility? Every tank needs to bring something other than being able to face tank a normal amount of stuff, and I think time will tell if the other tanks just haven't been played yet or if they are truly lacking. Hopefully with the relative buffs to other tanks and nerf to the flavor of the month too, we see more diversity in the near future. I'm really glad that, 90% of what's said here I totally agree with. I'm really glad to hear them say community perception is the big thing. I've been saying this for months, so there you go. There you go. Somebody else agrees. I can't really speak for healers other than my own experience playing with a handful. I feel like Druid and Mistweaver are able to tunnel into the single target healing or burst AoE healing very effectively, while Dix is very good at AoE healing while they have a hostile target to hit. They also bring 2 very good damage reduction cooldowns to augment their low single target healing. I haven't seen other healers in play. I'd love to hear what those that play feel like in keys. Are their weaknesses or what keeps them from doing higher keys? Yeah, the whole healer discussion is a bit weird, right? I feel like all 5 healers, other than Holy Priest, of course, that would be the 6th. I feel like 5 out of the 6 healers are very well balanced, and they all bring something pretty unique. So I still think Dix Priest is invaluable. It's kind of a shame that they didn't mention how much passive single target damage they're able to do. But I guess that doesn't really play into it when you're only worried about survival from the healing role. All right, bug and abuse and preparations. Oh god, this would be interesting. This would be interesting. To say there are a lot of bugs to begin with in BFA would be an understatement. That said, most of them were resolved quickly enough, or at least eventually. One of the biggest being pulling things through the floor in Waycrest Manor. Yeah, that was terrible. There are still some serious pathing issues. Often I find going anywhere near any sort of doodad results in me getting teleported. Oh, is it a doodad that does that? Interesting. Into the center of a pack and getting hit from all sides. There's some pretty insane bugs being abused by essentially every group right now in a few dungeons. The one where you could pre-pull enemies and avoid spawning them with infested has been mostly fixed, although I still think Frosty K's Fury could reach through walls that it can when Mother and Uldir. I don't know why that would be a thing though, right? But I don't know. Anyway, but that you can pre-spawn Captain Crag and Throt. Yeah, that should not even be. I can't believe that's in the game. Anyway, that kind of leads into the required preparation for pushing the highest keys. I'll say that we as a community are pretty widely responsible for this ourselves, since as soon as one group does something, another does it, and so on until it's basically required to keep up with everyone doing these tricks. Something that saw prevalence this season was pre-stacking Archive of the Titan stacks and getting Hellstones before the key started, which results in a lot of downtime. I'd personally love to see everything but consumable buffs like Flask and Food stripped down, or stripped when the key starts, like in PvP, since if there's significant power gain from something like pre-stacking a buff or getting Hellstones Mage Food before keys, we're going to do it. As much as I prefer we save ourselves where we can, I don't think this particular arms race is healthy or fun, nor is it going to change. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's kind of what you're dealing with here, but this whole like glitching out dungeons before you even enter them in Mythic Plus, this should be bannable. Honestly, this should be bannable. There's no reason that this should be in the game. The pre-stacking Archive of the Titans thing, I don't know. I guess that's fine, but yeah, I don't know. I just, I would like it if everything in the group was all that you can do, right? If you couldn't do something within the timer of Mythic Plus, then you can't do it. That would be my play. That would be what I would want to see. Okay, this is interesting. Reward structure. I was actually hoping for a lot more discussion here. It's kind of, that was not much at all. Reward structure. This is sad to see this. This is the part where I feel the most disappointment. Let's see what they have to say here. Until patch 8.1, there was only one achievement in the game for BFA Mythic Plus and a server first feat of strength. While there are a few mounts you can get, none of them are rewards for going as high as you can, but just for completing the dungeons in general. Raids have new transmogs, achievements, mounts, and titles for every tier. PvP has the same. Mythic Plus is supposed to be a progression path for small groups that don't want to PvP. Why does it feel like it's been ignored? Even with the weekly cash supposedly the equivalent of a Mythic raid item, that's not the case, but anyway, only drops 380 gear instead of 385, right? An intentional change, so Mythic Plus is not the de facto best way to gear up. The point is, everything about Mythic Plus feels unrewarding unless you are already part of a community that recognizes and acknowledges those that push for rating on a third-party website. That is so sad. That is really disappointing to hear that. It's really disappointing to hear that because it is so sad to hear. I mean, Mythic Plus gives so much fucking gear. It is unbelievable. Okay? So much fucking gear. It is unbelievable. And the fact that you're saying like, oh, it doesn't give it 385. It only gives it 380. That's a really fucking good gear. For like getting a 385 from a Mythic raid boss, it's a lot harder than doing a 10. You know what I mean? It's a lot harder than doing a single 10 once a week. I don't know, man. They really, Mythic Plus gives way, in my opinion, gives way too much. So let's see what else they have to say. As much as I didn't want to give suggestions, I strongly feel like there needs to be an in-game ladder system, as well as a reason to push high keys on weeks with theoretically poor affix combinations for the pushing the highest keystones. Huh. What a great idea. It's almost like if the Mythic Plus scoring system should take into account the affixes. Anyway, yeah, I definitely agree there should be an in-game ladder and that more in-game systems for sure. For instance, if I do an 18 freehold and that's the highest done on a hard week like bolstering explosive tyrannical, even if the highest key ever done in that dungeon for any combination was a 22, I feel like there should be the maximum reward for completing that 18 on a hard week. Hard to disagree. Ultimately, regardless of the solution, there needs to be a reason to do keys at any time rather than on specific easy weeks. It would make it easier for everyone to find groups and do keys if people felt rewarded for doing so, and not just on easy weeks. So let's get this straight. This is not actually a rewards problem. The dungeon is just imbalanced. You know, it's not well balanced. That's the thing. The gear is there. The rewards are always there, no matter what keystone you're doing. The problem is some weeks 22 is easier than 18 because the affix make it so, right? And the dungeon layout makes it so. That's not going to change. There's no way to do that. But the scoring system is what needs to change, okay? There needs absolutely... I cannot believe that I feel like I'm the only person who understands this. And I'm glad that this person at least somewhat mentions it. I don't understand why Raider.io does this. I have no idea why they think like every week should contribute equally to your score. It makes no fucking sense whatsoever. So I've said my part on that. Regardless how many times anybody else brings it up, I can't say any more about it. Having something akin to a PvP ladder system would give merit to people pushing to be competitive with each other more than just a third-party scoring system. PvPers and most recently Raiders with the Hall of Fame achievement, but even before that with achievement dates, have had those things in game bragging rights for a long time. Mythic Plus, as the D3 community has shown, as people's interest in the highest groups have shown, is not about completing a set challenge as fast as possible, but about going as high as you can. That's good to hear that. Well, it is kind of a shame. I would rather it be about doing it as fast as possible. I think that's what they wanted. But going as high as you can is good too. I think that's fine. That said, having the only rewards cut off at a certain arbitrary level of keystones isn't as productive to the system as having a ladder/reward system that scales with what people are actually able to do. No, this is not a good idea. I don't like this idea at all. Actually being able to do something is just, you're asking for more imbalance in the game. You're asking for more flavor of the month stuff. You're asking for more exploits. This is not a good idea. I hope that you are willing to change this kind of system in the near future to help incentivize players what is more or less evergreen content for you like PvP. I really hope they don't do this. I think this would be the worst mistake they could ever make. And they're not going to do it. I mean, let's be serious. They're not going to do this. Blizzard understands that this is just silly. But there definitely needs to be a ladder. There needs to be in-game recognition. And, you know, this person actually asked, now I remember, this person actually asked a question on the Q&A thread from a while back about why there's no actual season rewards. I was told there was going to be season rewards, but I guess up until now there doesn't appear to be any season rewards. So I wish there was season rewards. Like if you completed a 15 in time, you got something special other than a feat of strength. I don't know, but this is such a I'm not gonna. Anyway, I don't want to say what I want to say there. Judged on its own, this is plenty to like about Mythic Plus and BFA. Many interesting new dungeons and a focus on trash has definitely kept me engaged in a lot of our time doing keys this expansion. That said, when compared to Legion, I can't help but be very disappointed at the lack of growth from what was a brand new system. It feels like a lot of our feedback from last expansion fell on deaf ears, and what we got in return felt shoehorned in rather than being a primary focus of the game. Everything from the complete lack of achievements to the comparatively weaker loot since Azerite... Why do people spell it with a U? It's so weird. I don't understand. Anyway, gear only comes from the weekly cache, and it only, if you're extremely lucky, do you get something that's actually good. Some of this was fixed in 8.1, but it's almost like it was an afterthought. I hope my feedback reaches you, and I hope the community is able to chime in and debate or bring their opinions to the matter. If I forgot anything, I'll try to add it in the comments. Thank you for reading. You got 38 replies on your post, man. I don't know what to tell you. It's kind of sad. It's kind of fucking sad, to be honest. 38 replies. This is like 6,000 words. 17 days ago, it's got 38 replies. I don't think they're reading this. I think it's just too long. But I'm happy to do my part, man. I'm happy to. I really hope that I hope that people do see this. I do, because this time was well spent by this person. Let's put it that way. I'm kind of disappointed that they didn't. I was hoping to read more of their suggestions because I'd be interested in hearing what they had to say. But yeah. Now this is a person from their group. They also said, I'm going to read this also. I did forget something in the OP, something I thought would be a really great addition, especially in the light of recently announced Keystone Masters tournaments. What is this? Keystone Masters tournaments. I don't know what this is. Is a wargame style Keystone system where you can run whatever key you want in exchange for not getting the rewards. It would be awesome to get a chance to try some pulls without worrying about the timer, or to run a tournament like they're trying to do with Keystone Master without relying on the RNG of getting the right keys at the right level. I don't know what this is, but regardless, I guess I missed something. But anyway, yeah, a war game style for the Keystone system would be the best. It would be the best thing they could possibly add. Absolutely. The best thing they could possibly add. And I'm going to read this. I don't know if you guys know who this guy is, but he's like slowly clawing his way up the influencer culture here. So let's go ahead and read it. Let me chime in here as someone with a much better and much more prestigious radar IO score. I strongly agree that they're in the same group. They're joking. I think he is slightly better. But anyway, I strongly agree with the start of Keystone, removing all stacks of Archive, all Hellstones from bags, Incarnation, Metamorphosis, etc. Yeah, I'm glad that you agree, because that's something that should happen. I think that Infested is at its most interesting and skill testing in open dungeons like Freehold, or in areas like Krogma's room in Underrot, or Marikit's room in Temple of Sethralis. There are many options in front of you, and you have to try to weave together a coherent set of pulls that lets you efficiently pull all the Infested simultaneously. Unfortunately, with the linear design of some/all of most of the dungeons this expansion, these interesting Infested moments are the exception rather than the rule. And in places like King's Rest, every group basically pulls the same way when it comes to Infested. Explosive design is so close to great. I think if the numbers of explosives that spawn on a single target were roughly tripled, but the number that spawn on 5+ mobs was halved, that's an interesting point. The Affix would be much more interesting. As it stands right now, it's just another Affix that makes you pull smaller, and those are boring. Also, the rogue class is fine, and it really makes me feel my class fantasy when my friends can't do keys without me. This guy's a bit of a troll. But anyway, yeah, I was happy to have read this. It was so long, I can't really give a summary, but the thing I will definitely say is I'm happy that this guy didn't just basically say it's so hardcore being hardcore, because this is what I see so many people say, and this guy's above those people. Let's put it this way. This is a very accomplished human being, a person who plays the game very, very accomplished, very accomplished level, very serious about the game. Okay, these people who are commenting on my videos, you know who I'm talking about. You guys are accomplished too. All right, you're more accomplished than I am, and I'd hope so, because I don't do any competitive content in a group for 5-mans. But regardless, some things that people need to understand, okay? You can't just make everything easier. If everything gets easier, it's not a video game anymore. You know what I mean? If things are so easy that you can do 30s the first month of the expansion, it's not really competitive content. You know what I mean? The difference between bad and good players kind of gets blurred. Right now, I feel like there's a very good difference between bad and good players. I think, you saw it live. Go watch Wednesday's live stream. My God. We did an 8 Wakecrest Manor. First boss with the sisters. We go to sisters first. We wipe 6 times. 2 people literally don't interrupt. Not a single time. The whole boss does nothing but interrupt, cast abilities that are interruptible. Right? They don't know to move. They don't know how to deal with the stacks. They don't know to CEC. They don't know to pop their CDs before the boss, so we don't have to worry about immunities. They don't stand close enough so we can switch quickly. They don't do anything right. Not a single fucking thing was done right. Terrible DPS, 5k DPS. People are doing like 1k DPS. They're clearly just attacking mobs that they don't even realize are immune. And then we do it 12 on another alt. And we slaughter it. It was 12 to 8. What's the difference there? How much harder should that boss have been? Slaughtered it. Everybody did everything right. The healer never struggled. Nobody ever dealt with any mechanics poorly. People were close enough. We killed the MCs very quickly. Everybody switched to it. Plenty of interrupts. Lots of chain interrupts. I think that's working well. I really do. And that difference between 8 and 12 is significant. Because the difference between 12 and 20 is not what they're balancing around. They're not balancing around that. They're balancing around between 1 through, maybe 15. And then after that, you're in the Wild West. You know what I mean? These things are not balanced. They're not there on purpose. They're there because they couldn't possibly have anticipated people getting to this point, and with the comps they're getting there, how they're doing it. They can't do that. They're not psychics. You know what I mean? They're not a psychic type IRL. So it's just, you can't blame Blizzard for this. So I would want that to be clear. I want everybody to be clear on that, okay? When a mob is difficult, when the Berserkers and King's Rest are so difficult that you die to them on really high keys because it's hard. You know what I mean? That's on purpose. The problem is when other things are so easy that you're lulled into this sense of security here where, oh, I'm doing this 22. This trash is so easy. Oh my God, now this trash is really hard. What the fuck, Blizzard? It's like, you're not supposed to be doing it at 22. And the difference between, one pack and the next pack is the problem. That's what we should be talking about. It's not complaining that these mobs are too difficult. It's complaining that the challenge along the mob, alongside the mobs that aren't those mobs is not comprehensive. It's not a normal progression upward. Everything is either extremely easy or extremely hard in some of these dungeons. And I don't know how to fix that. I really don't. But I think King's Rest is a particularly problematic dungeon because there's so little trash. So little trash in that dungeon. So few ways that you could skip mobs. Like he said, 60-some% of it is mandatory. And that's because it's themed trash. It's not just, they're not just pirates walking around in Freehold. You know what I mean? It's mobs that are guarding the bosses, clearly defined to protect the boss or interact with the boss in some way. And the Zool ad, the Zool mini boss, clearly designed to interact with the final boss of King's Rest, right? So you're talking about you have some story there. You know what I mean? You can't have both. And as much as I would want, trust me, if I wasn't making this video, I'd be on this side too. Fuck all this nonsense. I used to say this all the time, right? If I could fight a gray blob, if I could have challenge, if I could progress, if I could make competitive progression against a gray blob with no sound or no visuals or no anything, I would do it. I would be satisfied doing that. Because I live for improvement, and I'm not the most accomplished or competitive player in the game, but it's what drives me every day. Why I wake up in the morning is because I want to get better. I want December 29th to be better than December 28th. I want January 3rd to be better than January 2nd. You know what I mean? It's my mom's birthday, January 3rd, by the way. Happy birthday. But anyway, I want every day to be slightly better than the previous day for me, even if it's slightly. Any day I go backwards is not good. I don't like that, okay? And this feels like going backwards in a lot of ways. Making excuses, saying like, oh, Blizzard did a bad job. These things are bad. These things are not good. That's an excuse. And that feels like going backwards to me. You know what I mean? I don't like that. So that's my opinions. There's a lot of things in here like this whole pylon discussion that is I could sympathize with. And I'm glad that they did add the thing that they added, that new toy. So hopefully we'll see that. That's going to be probably going to throw a wrench in the spanner. Or a spanner in the works. I don't know. Whatever that analogy is. Anyway, or that whatever. You know what I'm saying. But anyway, yeah, I definitely think CC being stripped away, making trash harder in general. This is working as intended. So if we have some problems with tuning, if you think that they can make the Spectral Berserkers less, again, I feel like they're only insanely punishing because the trash that precedes them and follows them in many dungeons are not insanely punishing. If every trash was insanely punishing, and the timer was just made longer, or whatever, the challenge was changed, then I don't think anybody would really care. It's just these outliers that I think Blizzard need to work on. And it's the same with dungeons, so. Anyway, that's that. Thanks for watching. If you guys have any comments, which I am sure you will, leave them down below. Again, if you watch the full video, let me know. You guys are the best. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.